So you have a camera that can shoot log. Maybe you've watched some YouTube videos, you've read some articles about the benefits of shooting in log and how by doing so, you can squeeze every little last detail out of your image, you can get the best dynamic range as possible, and you can get the best possible image quality from the camera that you own.
Whoa.
To you, this seems like a no-brainer. Anything you can do to get the best image quality possible, you want to try out. You go out and you shoot your next project in log. You bring it back, you copy it to your computer, you do the edit, and it's time for you to color. And you start running into issues. Maybe the footage is looking more noisy than it did when you were shooting in a normal profile. Maybe your highlights ended up being so blown out that they weren't recoverable, which isn't what you expected. You thought that by shooting in log, you would have better dynamic range. Maybe no matter what you try doing in the color grade, you're not able to get the image to look exactly right. It still looks a little bit off. Or it's just taking you so much time to color grade that you're starting to question if it was even worth it to shoot in log in the first place. These are all issues that I ran into when I first started shooting log. I assume that a lot of you are feeling the same way. So right off the bat, let's just admit it, color grading log footage is not easy. Even though theoretically you do have more dynamic range, you do have more flexibility in the color grade, if you don't know how to properly color grade that log footage, you're gonna end up with an image that is not as good as if you just shoot in a normal profile. There's a lot of videos out there talking about one specific technique to color grade log footage, and in my opinion, there's no right or wrong way to color grade log footage. It all depends on your workflow, how long you want to spend color grading it, and it really depends on what look you want to end up with. Some methods are more technically accurate than others, and other methods are based on feel and how the image looks and how it portrays a specific mood. So in this video, I want to present to you 3 different ways that I like to color grade log footage. Like I said, these techniques range from very technical to very easy and something that anybody can do. Now, a few disclaimers right off the bat. Getting a good color grade in your log footage is completely dependent on your ability to capture a proper image. If the image is overexposed, if it's underexposed, if it's too noisy, then you're just gonna be fighting the footage more than utilizing it in the color grade. So with that, let's get into it. So we're here in DaVinci Resolve. I'm also going to be switching between Resolve and Premiere Pro to show you how these techniques in Resolve translate if you're using Premiere Pro. Now, the first technique I want to show you guys is to use your camera manufacturer's conversion LUTs from their website. Now, each camera manufacturer will make conversion LUTs from different log profiles to Rec. 709. And the benefit of using these is that your camera manufacturer who made the sensor knows the exact color science that goes into it. And so their conversion LUTs are going to be extremely technically accurate, and they're going to get you the most natural colors, and they're going to allow you to take the most advantage of that color science as possible. So since this was shot on Fuji F-Log, I went to the Fuji website, I searched for it, and they have F-Log 3D LUT files. You can convert F-Log to a bunch of different formats, but my favorite one is the F-Log to Eternal LUT. So if you do have a Fuji camera, definitely go ahead and try that out. So once you download the LUTs and load them into your program, you can just have your first node. I'm going to call it conversion. And I have my F-Log to Eternal LUT right here, and I'm going to apply it, and instantly it's converted to Rec. 709 Colorspace. Now, I definitely would not leave it here. There's definitely still more work that can be done on this footage. You can see that we still have a lot of room in our scopes, in the shadows and the highlights to adjust things, but this is a really good starting point to work from. Now, the same thing to do in Premiere. You can just click on your footage, and then I've loaded the conversion LUTs into the technical folder so that they're in the input LUT dropdown. And basically I'm going to take this and I'm going to do the F-Log to Eternal LUT. And right there in Premiere, we have the conversion done. So what do you do from here? Say your conversion LUT that you downloaded just isn't looking super natural. It's not giving you the results you want, and it needs a little bit more work. I'm gonna make a few additions to the node structure. I'm gonna make 2 more nodes after and 1 node before. And I'm gonna call this node primaries. And I'm gonna call this node adjust. This node is going to be creative. And I'm gonna make 1 last node. And I'm gonna call it secondary. So basically this node structure is created so that we have our conversion LUT happening right here, and then we can adjust the footage much easier while we're in a Rec. 709 Colorspace. Our creative node is for applying a creative LUT, and our secondary node you can use to add your specific flavor. Maybe you need to adjust the highlights or shadows, bump up the contrast a little bit, whatever you need to do. And then our primaries node is for adjusting exposure and white balance. On the creative LUT, I'm just going to apply one of the LUTs from the LUTCO Spectra pack. I think Alliance would do pretty well here. The shadows are a little bit lifted, so I'd like to bring those down a little bit closer to black. So I'm just gonna pull that down a tiny bit, not too much, but you can see maybe a little bit more, something like that. Say I wanted to make it a little bit warmer or cooler, or bring up the overall exposure up or down. You want to do that before you convert the footage, because the conversion LUT is basically destructive. So any transformations that happen in this LUT, you're not going to get back in any of these other nodes. So you want to make sure that you're adjusting exposure and white balance in this primary node so that you have access to as much color information as possible. So in this primaries node, say I want to bring the exposure up a little bit, I'm going to use the offset wheel to adjust exposure and white balance before I convert to log. So in this offset wheel, I can bring it up or down, and you can kind of see the extremes, what's happening here. Even if I push it really far, the beauty of this workflow is that this conversion LUT is actually compressing the highlights and shadows so that it keeps me from going over or under too much. Now, this is an extreme case and I would never push it that far, but it's just interesting to see how far you can go with it. So I'm just gonna bump the exposure up a tiny bit to bring a little more life into the image. And then I'm just gonna cool it down, add a little more magenta. And something like that seems good to me. And maybe I'll bring the exposure down a little more. So that's before and after, before and after. In the adjustment tab, you can do small things while you're in the Rec. 709 conversion. Things like qualifiers or color curves, things that you want to adjust before you send it to the creative LUT, you would do in here. And so you can add as many nodes as you want in this middle space, but that's where you would do that kind of work. In addition, if you're doing any sort of saturation adjustments, you would do it in the first node right here. So I can bring up the saturation and that actually looks a lot better. Now, if I ever wanted to adjust the creative LUT, the beauty of this now is that since it's one of the last nodes, it doesn't affect anything below it. So if I've done any color keying or curves or anything like that, I can change this without having any negative effects. So say I want to try a different LUT like Vantage, which is a lot warmer, or Jesty, which has kind of greenish shadows. Integra, these are a little more vibrant. So you can see here that you have a lot of flexibility in your color grade when going through all of these different looks and styles. So how do you do this in Premiere? Well, there's a few workarounds because of the way that the Lumetri color effect is ordered. Basically, from the top to bottom is the order that the image is processed. So if you imagine each of these steps as a single node, this is the order that they're being processed. So the problem of this is that if we want to apply our input LUT and then make other basic corrections, we actually want to do that before we convert it to Rec. 709. You have a couple options. If your entire timeline is footage from the exact same camera, say my entire timeline is Flog footage, what I can do is actually take this lumetri color effect where I'm converting the Flog to Rec. 709, and I can actually cut it, and then I'm actually going to make a new adjustment layer. And I'm just going to put it over top of all three of these clips. And I'm actually going to paste it to the adjustment layer. And so the beauty of this is that now I've converted every single shot to the Rec. 709 color space without having to do any extra work. The other benefit of doing this is that since the creative adjustment happens after the basic correction, I can also apply my creative look to this without having to sacrifice any sort of order of operations. And so now from here, all I have to do is work along this bottom line if I want to adjust any shots individually. So adjusting these shots individually is the same as going through and adjusting my primaries node in Resolve. On this clip, I'm going to go to basic correction. I'm going to bring the exposure up a little bit and maybe bring the temperature down a little bit, and then bring up the saturation maybe to around 110. Maybe a little magenta to flatten it out. And so I've done a basic color correction underneath my log conversion and creative LUT. And I can see exactly how it's looking as I adjust those. So I'm gonna go to my next clip, and now I can do the exact same thing. In this shot, I feel like the shadows are pretty dark, so I'm just gonna lift up the shadows. And I would love to add more saturation and maybe bring down the temperature a little bit to bring out that blue in the water right there. And just like that, we have a gorgeous grade. This is our primary correction. And then on this layer, we have our conversion LUT and our creative LUT loaded in there. And so that's what this is doing. It's making a huge difference on the footage. And we haven't had to do any custom curves, and we know that we're getting the best color science out of this footage as possible. So I hope you can see the power of this method. If you have any sort of titles or anything on this track, you can either put them on the track above it, or you can just simply make a little hole in the adjustment layer and then continue it. Whatever works best for you is what you can do there. So what if you really don't want to use your camera manufacturer's conversion LUT? What you want to use to convert it from log to Rec. 709 is called an S-curve. And so I'm going to reset our entire node graph and start from scratch. And basically you have two methods in DaVinci Resolve to create an S-curve. The first method, which I like the best, is to use the contrast and pivot on the primaries. And these tools are extremely powerful for color grading log footage because the contrast slider actually is a built-in S-curve. So by increasing or decreasing, you're increasing the amount that the S-curve is doing to the footage. So to begin, I'm just going to start pushing this S-curve and seeing how far I can push it. Now you want to remember, don't push it too far, because you want to leave yourself a little bit of room in the end for whatever curve is built into your creative LUT. Let's put it to 1.5. And now your pivot function is really cool because it's basically adjusting the midpoint of that S-curve. So if you push it up or down, you can see what it's doing in the parade scopes and in the image. It's basically compressing the highlights and the shadows without pushing them past a certain point that your S-curve is set to. So if your footage is over or underexposed, you can play with the contrast and pivot to bring down the highlights or bring up the shadows without clipping. You're just basically compressing them. Let's set the pivot to 0.4, and I'm going to increase the saturation to bring some of that color in. And so now you're probably kind of seeing the difference between using a contrast and pivot method compared to using the camera manufacturer's LUTs, because you're not adjusting any sort of color shifts or anything like that that happen in the sensor. You're basically just increasing the contrast and boosting the saturation at a global level. And so if I make a new version in DaVinci Resolve, and I reset this node, and I apply our Flog to Eterna LUT and switch back and forth between them, you can see that there is a slight difference. This one is a lot more green. This one looks a lot more natural. And this is another look. This is another way to do it. And so from here, I'm going to use the same node structure as before. So I'm going to call this conversion. And I'm going to make a serial node, label it adjust, make another one called creative, and I'm going to make another one called secondary, and finally, I don't know why I'm doing it this way, but I'm going to make primary last, clean up node graph. In our creative LUT, I'm going to go back to the Spectra pack, and actually let's do the wedding LUT. The wedding LUT is great, super natural looking. And then I'm going to go to the primary tab, and since it has a bit of a green cast, I'm just going to try to push in a little more magenta into that, maybe cool it down a bit so we have something like that going on. And then say we want to add a little pop saturation after the fact. I'll do 1.1, something like that. And then say we want to do a bit of an adjustment in between. Say we want to, do something with the skin tones, make sure that they're on that line. So I'm just going to make a quick red preset, make sure we're on those skin tones. That looks good. I'm just going to push the offset so that they're looking, this pot is my skin tones, if you haven't noticed. So I can push a little more color into there. That's looking pretty nice. Gets rid of that green cast. And yeah, basically that's our color grade. We've converted Fuji F-Log to Rec. 709 using our contrast and pivot tools. And we've made an adjustment to the skin tones, added our creative LUT, adjusted our creative LUT with a secondary, adding a bit of contrast pop, and we've adjusted the white balance using our primary before our conversion. Now, if we went to our second clip and we want to apply it, we can just hit the equals sign and see what that does. That looks pretty great. And we're gonna go to our third clip, hit the equals sign. Looks pretty great. If we wanted to, we can go to our primary. We can just do a bit of an adjustment to cool it off. I'm gonna go back to my parade scopes, make sure these three lines are perfectly lined up so that we know that it's pure white, because your eyes will fool you. And bring down the exposure a bit. With this setup, it becomes really easy to switch clip to clip, keep this node selected, and just keep hitting the equal sign. For each clip, you can just stay on this primary once you have everything else dialed in, and adjust exposure and white balance for each shot. Before you know it, you'll be finished. So to do this in Premiere, we're going to keep the exact same setup with our clips and adjustment layer, but instead of using this input LUT, we're going to have to create custom curves in Lumetri Color. Now, the only issue with this is now our curves is happening after our creative LUT. And so we need our log to Rec. 709 conversion to happen before the creative LUT. I'm gonna set this for Alliance, and then I'm gonna make a new adjustment layer, and I'm gonna delete Lumetri in the first one. So I've got Alliance there, And then this one is the one that's gonna do the log conversion. So this adjustment layer is going to be our log conversion, and then this adjustment layer is going to be where we apply the creative look. The contrast slider in Premiere is not an S-curve. So do not use the contrast slider in Premiere. I would stay away from this slider at all costs. Instead, our highlights and shadows sliders have a bit of an S-curve built into them. I'm not really sure exactly what it's doing. So you could either use those or you can create custom curves in the RGB curves tab. We're just gonna make a basic S-curve. We're gonna make a point down here, bring our shadows down, then we're gonna make a point up here, bring our highlights up, and that's looking pretty strong. So I'm just gonna play around with this a bit. And basically you can just play around with this S-curve. It's the equivalent of adjusting contrast and pivot until your image is looking like it has a good amount of contrast. So yeah, you're kind of trying to finesse it to figure out what sort of curve you need to convert that log footage to Rec. 709, balancing that with how much saturation you want to add. And then this is looking kind of warm. Those leaves are looking really brown. So I'm probably gonna decrease the color temperature a little bit, maybe increase, maybe push it a little bit green. Let's change the creative LUT to something a little more natural looking, maybe Integra. And then we're going to go back to our footage and bring up the color temperature. When you're using your own S-curve and creating your own look, you're gonna have to play with the footage a little more, try to adjust it to get to a point where it's starting to look natural. But once you get to that point, it's great because then you can go in between clips. Since you have your conversion LUT and your creative LUT on top of it, all you need to do is go back and adjust your different shots. So since we have a different LUT on here, we're gonna have to adjust this a little bit. So I'm just going to adjust the white balance on this to make it look a little more natural. And then we're gonna go to our last shot and it's looking a little green now. So we'll push in some magenta. So that's before and after. And if we turn off these two, you can see that this was before and after. I'm turning off the conversion curves and the creative LUT. So that's before and after, and finally before and after. So that's another way in Premiere to convert your log footage to Rec. 709 for color grading. All right, so the third and final method of converting log footage to Rec. 709 happens to actually be my favorite. Now, the good news is that there is a free version of DaVinci Resolve, and this effect is included in the free version. So that could be another opportunity for you to try out DaVinci Resolve. So like the first method where I used a LUT, I'm going to use the same process, but instead of using a LUT, I'm going to use the Colorspace transform effect. Now, the beauty of this effect is that it's non-destructive. So what you can do is just apply the Colorspace transform, and we're gonna set our input gamma, and we're gonna go down to Fuji F-Log. I'm just hitting F to get down to there. And then we're gonna set our output gamma to Rec. 709 and our output color space to Rec. 709. So now the beauty of this effect is that if you look at our parade, it appears that our red and green channels are clipped. However, if we make a node after and I bring down the gain, you can see that all of that information is actually still there. There's a pretty simple way to adjust this by adjusting the tone mapping method. And so this basically adds some sort of highlight roll-off that are predetermined. So I can either choose simple, which kind of brings that down, or luminance mapping, which I actually prefer. It's a little more of a mathematical way for it to convert it. The other really cool thing about this effect is that if I have a LUT that's expecting, say, RE log C as an input, I can actually convert the Fuji F-Log to the RE Log C color space. So instead of Rec. 709, I'm just going to use timeline, and then I'm going to convert the output gamma to RE Log C. And not a huge difference, but then if I make another node and say I want to use the RE Log C to Rec. 709 LUT, now I can use that to convert it to Rec. 709, and then I can add any creative LUTs and adjustments after that. So I can go into my Spectra LUT pack and apply maybe Monaco 2, nice and warm. And then at this point, if I wanted to adjust exposure and white balance, I would just make a node before everything, just like the first method. And I can bring the exposure up. I can increase the saturation to add a little more color separation, and maybe decrease the color temperature and adjust the offset until it's looking like it's in a natural spot. In these few short methods, I've actually converted the F-Log to RE Log C, and then applied my creative LUT and adjusted the white balance. And you can see that's before and that's after. Before and after. Now, if I make a new version by hitting Command Y, you can see what would happen if instead of the Colorspace transform, I just used the Fuji LUT to convert to Eterna. And I'm also going to turn off my RE Log C LUT. I'm just going to go to Eterna. You can kind of see the difference that's happening here. So this is using the Fuji Eterna LUT, and this is using the Colorspace transform to RE Log C, and then the RE Log C LUT, and then our creative LUT. And so this is the Fuji, and this is the Log C. This is Fuji and Log C. So it's definitely a different look. You can see a lot more detail in the waves here. The highlights aren't as compressed as they are when you're using the F-Log to Eterna LUT. But yeah, that's kind of another look that you can go for. And there's some really powerful things that you can do with the Colorspace transform tool. And the beauty of it, like I said, is that it's non-destructive. And so anything you do here in the output, you can still access that data. You'll likely end up with more natural looking highlight roll-off, more natural looking skin tones. If there's really bright spots on those skin tones, you have more control. You're basically creating a LUT that you can adjust after the fact. I hope you can see why that's kind of my favorite way to convert log footage to Rec. 709. There's all of these different input color spaces and gammas. If you're shooting in Canon log, if you're shooting on Blackmagic, DJI D-Log, they also have Sony S-Log 2 and S-Log 3, which are super powerful. If you have a timeline with different cameras in it, you can use the tool to unify them all to the same color space and then apply the same creative LUT. If you guys were able to follow along with me until this point, I am super proud of you. I know that shooting and color grading log footage can be very overwhelming at first, and it definitely takes a lot of practice. So give yourself patience, give yourself grace. Over time, you'll get more used to it. And I think in the end, once you learn how to color grade log footage properly, you really can get the most out of your camera, and you can create superior images to the ones that you were getting before with the extra detail. And if you're looking for more videos and tutorials for color grading, make sure you hit the subscribe button, like this video. I will see you guys in the next one.